Brooklyn and Queens are two of the biggest boroughs in New York City, both in terms of land area, where Queens is number 1 and Brooklyn is number 2, and in terms of population, where Brooklyn is number 1 and Queens is number 2. Both were established as an alternative to the crowded Manhattan, and home to incredible diversity. So, you would think with how developed Brooklyn and Queens are, there is an easy to comprehend border that separates them, right? No. As I said in the previous video, the history and politics of New York City are so whack that it does not allow for it. So, where does Brooklyn end and Queens begin? Are there any signs or markings that show the border? How formal are these borders? In this video, we are going to go over this border, as unlike other boroughs where a body of water separates them, this border is on land. And even though this border is still subject to debate, we will be using the official borders. Without further ado, let's begin. Let's start in the west, and would you look at that? I lied. A body of water separates Brooklyn and Queens here, namely the Newtown Creek. The Newtown Creek runs for 2.5 miles before ending here in East Williamsburg, and that is where the land border starts. But while doing research, I noticed that there are enclaves of Brooklyn in Google Maps. However, in census maps and other government maps, there aren't any enclaves. So I am a bit confused, and I couldn't find an answer on this. So if there is anyone that can explain this to me, please do. But anyways, the Newtown Creek border here is filled with industry and different rail yards. Though in recent times, the Queens side of the border has been upzoned. But generally speaking, this is pretty industrial, as a ton of factories and warehouses dot the landscape. As you go further east, we have the Newtown Creek Wastewater Treatment Plant, which is one of the biggest and most important wastewater treatment facilities in New York City. If you live in Lower Manhattan, Brooklyn, or Queens, chances are your water is being treated by this facility. As you keep going east, it is more of the same. And then you see the Kosciuszko Bridge above. This bridge did not used to look like this, as the original bridge looked like this. However, this bridge was much more structurally deficient and was replaced. However, the new bridge was made wider to ease traffic, and that failed because of induced demand, and the bridge is still choked with traffic. But other than the bridge, it is more of the same, until the Newtown Creek ends and the land border begins. The first part of the land border is a mess. It starts on Onderdock Avenue, and rather than continuing with the street until maybe Flushing Avenue, the border cuts through a packaging plant and some stores. And this is a heads up. This border will continue to cut through buildings down the line. So much for the let's not cut the border through buildings. Anyway, once the border reaches Flushing Avenue, it turns, before turning again along Cypress Avenue. Here, the border stabilizes and runs for 0.6 miles. The border then turns on Menahan Street, before turning on St. Nicholas Avenue. The border runs just 3 blocks before turning on Gates Avenue, and then turns on Wyckoff Avenue. The border then stabilizes on Wyckoff Avenue for a while, before turning near Eldert Street, before turning again on Irving Avenue. On the west side, there is the LIRR Bushwick branch, a freight railroad that serves the industrial neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens. But as you slowly make your way uphill, there are more homes, shops, and more density. That density peaks around Myrtle Avenue, as there is an elevated train line above. Combined with the fact that there is also a subway line, the L train, running below Wyckoff Avenue, this is why this is the densest part of the border. And this border makes for some interesting facts on the L train. Since the border runs on Wyckoff Avenue for a while, which is where the L train also runs under, there are stations that are both in Brooklyn and Queens. Halsey Street is one of them, but also Myrtle Avenue, Wyckoff Avenue. After Halsey Street, the scene turns more industrial, though it is still residential. However, there are no markings that show the Brooklyn-Queens border here, so things can get pretty tricky. In fact, in 2012, artists were denied entry into the Brooklyn Museum studio project because they had Queens zip codes. But the artists considered themselves to be from Bushwick. But it doesn't end here, as this part of the border was the reason why there was a Brooklyn-Queens border in the first place. Bushwick, Brooklyn used to be a Dutch town, and Newtown, Queens used to be an English town. These two towns could not agree where the border was, and men would often stone each other. To ease the tensions, in 1768, a straight line was drawn from a rock called Arbitration Rock. Anything southwest of the line was Brooklyn, anything northeast of the rock is Queens. That did calm tensions, but introduced a problem of borders cutting through people's homes. So in 1931, the city redrew its borders to fit the street grid, and that is how we got this Brooklyn-Queens border. But again, it is not entirely foolproof. Not just because there was an incident in 2012, but also ask people where Bushwick ends and Ridgewood begins. The border here is still subject to debate. After Moffat Street, however, Irving Avenue ends. This means the border does not follow a street and cuts right through a cemetery. And if you think the border here is consistent, well, not really, as it starts straight, but then sharply turns twice before being straight again. And that is not all. Once the border reaches the other side, it turns sharply to follow Jackie Robinson Parkway for about 0.2 miles, before turning through a park, then through more homes, before turning onto Highland Boulevard. The border here reaches its highest point, at about 135 feet. So unlike the many misnomers around the city, like Bay Ridge 95th Street not being in Bay Ridge, or Flushing Avenue not being in Flushing, Highland Boulevard is correctly named. And if you guess that it would be only another 0.2 miles before the border has another spasm, you are wrong. It would be 0.3 miles before it does another spasm and runs through another cemetery. A quick side note here, Google has the border turn much earlier, while the census map has the border turn much later. So, choose whatever you want, because the end result is not 0.2 miles, as it meant anything. On this part of the border, it is majority forests and cemeteries. But the old Ridgewood Reservoir used to be near here. This used to be the primary reservoir for Brooklyn, until the consolidation of New York City in 1898 allowed Brooklyn access to the entirety of the New York City water system. The Ridgewood Reservoir became less and less used, until it was decommissioned and drained in 1989. After it was drained, trees and other plants began to grow on it, and an entire ecosystem sprung up. So, in 2004, the reservoir was turned into a park, and today, it is pretty unique, as it shows an entire wetland and forest ecosystem in a dense city like New York City. The border continues to run along the cemetery before it turns 90 degrees at around 75th Street and cuts through a track and a school before finally running along a street again, Eldred's Lane to be exact. And this is the most consistent part of the border, running along Eldred's Lane for about 0.65 miles. The border then turns on 95th Avenue before turning on Drew Street. The border then runs for 2 blocks on Drew Street before turning on Liberty Avenue, before turning on 75th Street. Here, the scene reverts back to residential, though it is less dense than the northern border that we encountered earlier. You do pass underneath 2 elevated train lines, the BMT Jamaica line and the Liberty Avenue L, the latter of which descends into a tunnel after the Brooklyn-Queens border. Continuing to go south, you will be in the vicinity of one of the most infamous April Fool's joke in the history of the New York City subway, the 76th Street station. NicoBK has done a good video on this, so link below if you want to watch it. Finally, you reach Conduit Boulevard, a water conduit that connected the old Ridgewood Reservoir used to run here, hence the name Conduit Boulevard. This is also why there is so much space here. In fact, Robert Moses saw the space as a good way to build his Bushwick Expressway, but due to opposition, that expressway was shelved. But once you cross Conduit Boulevard, the border cuts through the Hole, one of the most infamous neighborhoods in New York City. Basically, this neighborhood is 30 feet below sea level, and is prone to flooding. And this shows, as the land begins to slope down, and many old automobiles dot the landscape. The roads here are barely paved, and many plants and trees are growing on plots of land. It is suffering from disinvestment, though the city wants to elevate the Hole and connect it to the rest of the sewer system. So it will be interesting to see what will happen to the Hole in the future. Anyway, the border runs through that neighborhood, first on 75th Street, then Ruby Street, then Dumont Avenue, and finally on 78th Street. 78th Street becomes Sapphire Street, then becomes 78th Street again, before turning west on 155th Avenue and into the woods. While in the woods, it turns south and continues running until it hits the street, 75th Street, before turning west on 157th Avenue, and then running until the edge of Spring Creek. And with that, that is pretty much it. A chaotic 11-mile border that separates Brooklyn and Queens. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, consider liking and subscribing. And I'll see you in the next video.